All right, good evening. Welcome everyone to our webinar tonight. My name is Annalise Singh. I'm the current president of Division 17, Counseling Psychology, and I'm thrilled to be with our panelists tonight in the webinar called, I love your title by the way, Watch We Do Not Say, wait, Watch We Do, not what we do, not what we say. That was my mistake, folks. White allies centering liberation to dismantle white supremacy. And what I love about the title is that there can be such a difference between behavior and words and actions and feelings and all the things. And this webinar tonight is part of the 12 months of building a counseling psychology of liberation. So I'm extremely grateful to all of our panelists for being here with us tonight. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves and say a little bit about the work they've done. So we're going to start off with Casey.
Thank you, Annalise. Super excited and grateful in all the fields to be on this. My name is Casey. I'm a third-year doc student at Georgia State. And gosh, this is such an important concept to me and my work and my family and the people I love, and I'm just super stoked to be here. So currently, I guess if we're talking a little bit about the work that we're doing, I've been involved in our local Surge chapter, which is like showing up for racial justice in Atlanta. Also, just because I'm a doc student, and one of the really significant realms of my life is research. Research is a sphere that I really try to put anti-racist practice into my work. So my research interests are on racial allyship. From the perspective of people of color too. So really complementing that co-created dynamics of racial allyship. Yeah, and that's me. Just excited to be here.
Thank you, Casey. And next up is Amy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Reynolds. I am a associate professor of counseling psychology at the University of Buffalo. I'm also the director of our training program. I've been focusing on anti-racism work, particularly around whiteness, since the beginning of my career over 30 years ago, when I first was in a Women Against Racism group in my very first professional job as a staff psychologist at the University of Iowa Counseling Center. And that was, I would say, one of the most transformational experiences of my personal life and career. I always say that I learned the most about race in Iowa, which is sort of a funny thing, but it's true, because I learned about myself. And right now, currently, I'm working with Rebecca Topork and other people about within SCP leadership, as well as the membership at large, looking at whiteness and running some groups at APA and at the summit. So excited to continue this work with my great colleagues here today.
Awesome. Thank you, Amy. Dan.
Hi, I'm Dan Walensky. I'm an associate professor in the Psychological Studies of Education department at Temple University. And, like my colleagues, I think that finding myself in a group, for me, it was Social Justice Training Institute, doing a week-long immersion in race and focusing on whiteness more deeply than I think I ever had, really opened my eyes to moving more systemically and away from some of the personal, while also integrating the personal into the systemic. That has really been shifted some of my understanding of what I'm doing in the field and as a friend and as a person and in my life. So.
Awesome. Thank you, Dan. Shannon.
Hi, I'm Shannon Soley. I am a therapist in private practice in Seattle, Washington. I'm also an adjunct professor at Seattle University and Antioch University here in the Seattle area. What do I do? What have I done? I think probably my biggest and proudest accomplishment is that a year ago, we opened the Heart Collective in the Columbia City neighborhood of Seattle, and it's a collective of anti-oppression focused healers who work together somatically, but also individually in our practices to create space to make change and liberatory practices within our building, and hopefully then radiating out into our neighborhoods and individual communities. And that has been probably one of my biggest and brightest learning places. And this stemmed out of a social justice healers group that went defunct when we got stuck in whiteness. So, yeah.
Isn't that amazing how that happens? Thank you, Shannon. And I'm going to ask, last but not least, Tiffany to introduce herself, and then I'm going to give you a couple of quick overview, housekeeping things about the webinar itself. Thanks, Tiffany.
So hi, I'm Tiffany O'Shaughnessy, and I am currently in my private practice office. So I do that part-time, and then I also am an associate professor of counseling at San Francisco State. And I'm the director of the Member Interface Board, I believe is my title here at Society of Counseling Psych. So my path to this, I think we really started when I was, how I actually know Shannon, a young sort of punk in Reno and Sparks area, and learning about, you know, for me as a white woman, often kind of is like feminism. And then I was like, oh, wait, being a woman isn't the only thing. And oh God, I have all this whiteness and privilege. And it kind of stumbled through all of that, and had some amazing teachers that helped me sort of recognize that in different collectives in different parts of the country. So learning about race in Denver, Pennsylvania, the Bay Area, it's learned a lot. And yeah, so that's been a part of my process. I've been part of lots of groups, White Women Unlearning Racism and feminist psych organizations, and some local work with some community activists here in Oakland. So just, yeah, it's been a long journey that I feel like I'm still just slowly moving along, trying to do this work. And I'm so excited to be here with everyone.
Thank you, everyone. A couple of quick housekeeping notes that as you're listening to tonight's webinar, we want you to be involved. The panelists want to dialogue with you. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to ask questions throughout the webinar. And as moderator, I'll be popping off, but popping back on to moderate the Q&A at the end. So you'll also have an opportunity to ask questions at the end. So thank you all so much, and looking forward to everything you have to share with us.
Thanks, Annalise. So I'm just gonna, as we were all preparing for what should we be sharing with you all when we're talking about watch what we do, not what we say, we realize that we tend to move into this hyper intellectualized space when we talk about race as white folks. And so I'm going to turn it over to Shannon now, who's going to lead us through a grounding exercise to just help us drop in, and then we'll be moving through a series of questions.
So this grounding exercise is open to anybody that wants to join in, but really this is also so that the 5 of us who are on the call together can kind of drop into ourselves and be present with one another as we're talking today. So I hope we're all comfortable, but get comfy if you're not. And as you're in your seat, just start by checking in and noticing you are breathing. Your eyes can be open and softly gazing. They can be closed. You don't need to alter your breath. You don't need to judge it. The body does it. We just breathe. And as you're breathing, imagine that there is a little ball of light below your belly button, in a little deeper towards your spine. And as you breathe, the ball gets bigger. And as you breathe out, it gets smaller, but it does not disappear. This ball of light sits at our power center. This is our grounding place, our inner intuition. That's what connects us to everything else. The more curiosity we can bring to this place, the more curiosity we can bring to that around us. So be curious. What does this ball of light have to show you Because we want to move through this webinar today, being connected to our intuition, to our bodies, to our hearts, and to our minds. As we come back to the webinar, to our screens and to each other, draw a cord as you bring yourself back up into the room around you from this ball of light, up through your heart into your head. And as you come back to the screen, take a second to just look at each of us. See the people that we're connecting to today. Hello.
Hello. Thank you, Shannon. So the first question that we wanted to kind of ground this webinar is for folks to respond to: what does liberatory practice around whiteness mean to you, and how do you practice it?
About when I think about that question, but also during that grounding exercise was a quote, and I think it's by Baldwin, if I remember correctly, that talks about liberation and this idea that, like, if you're coming to, I think it's called, if you're coming to help, like, it's not very helpful, but if you're coming because your liberation is bound to mine, then we can work together. And I think, to me, that that's something, when I think about liberatory practice, even around whiteness, is that it is that connection, that liberation is, when you talked about that connective light and how that connects to all of us, like that just visualization of that quote, and that came up for me.
I think that liberatory practice surrounding whiteness for me involves recognizing ways in which, as a white person, I hold space in a system, but is not reflective of my personhood. And that feels liberatory. That feels like something I can really work with.
For me, in my teaching, advising, and in my work within the division, the focus a lot is on just understanding all the hidden ways in which whiteness is part of who we are, and what we do and what we say and how we view the world, and holding that gently, as opposed to in a guilt-induced way. I think that often whiteness is held, and it's sort of accepting that duality. We talked about this a lot, but there's a lot of dualities in whiteness, and I think it's accepting our whiteness and all its power and privilege, but doing it with an open heart and not in a judgmental way of ourselves or others. And to me, that's always an ongoing work, and one that's very important.
I would say, for me, directly tied into liberatory practice is unlearning. I see that in myself and most of the folks that I work with, and in the classroom and spaces that I'm a part of, there's an active unlearning of ways of like correct ways of being, and expectations that almost needs to happen in order to move into liberatory practice. And so holding the both and of like unlearning, which is a disorientation and a very uncomfortable place. You don't know where you're going next. It gives you the opportunity to then turn toward liberatory practice of that what next is what's expansive.
Yeah, I feel that piece of unlearning. I think as I was thinking that for me, it's about taking responsibility and like working to be a better listener. But that unlearning piece is so huge, because there's this way that, you know, that my experience is seen as the default. And so that whenever I have like a really strong reaction of like, well, that's just not the way things are done, or, you know, that thinking about, well, why, and what are the many ways that there might be to go about these, and what are the ways that I'm abusing power, or assuming that I deserve something that I didn't earn. So just really trying to interrogate everything and there's also this piece of being willing to be unpopular, which I guess when we get to other things later, there's this like, it can be really, whiteness is like a easy to go along with wave. This like, you just like write it and it's going to be fine. We can chill. It's going to be, but it's not, right? The place it's taking the world is terrible. The places that we're going, I don't want to just kind of cruise along, but it is really easy to do. And so to notice every day, what are the ways that I just coasted today on my day? What are the ways that I got through some doors a little easier today just because, and how can I be aware of that, and what can I do about it?
Well, and I think we talked a lot about how we have to remember to do that in all white spaces as well. Like a lot of times we only think about our race when we're in groups where we're either in the minority, or there's a, you know, whatever the tipping point is for any one person of people of color in the room. That's when we think about it and interrogate our whiteness. But we really, to what Dan said, have to interrogate our whiteness all the time, because it's sort of structurally built into how we think about the world, and regardless of who's in the room.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to go with our next question. And then if other things came up, feel free to chime in. And as we were prepping for this, nobody had mutes on, and now we do. So it's getting the flow of our conversation going will be interesting. The next question was, within your unique role. So we have practitioner, faculty, student, supervisor, supervisee, leader, community member, parent, child. How do you enact your anti-racism efforts?
I'm going to just spitball words rather than sentences. And that's practice, talk, fumble. It's weird. The word lead came in there, but I'm like, no, I don't really lead in it. Maybe in certain spaces. There's a lot of like bravery and responsibility in terms of like showing up beyond guilt, pushing past guilt and showing up to the responsibility of being a person within these roles.
I find that really powerful, recognizing that many of us work in quite hierarchical systems that thrive on values and systems associated with whiteness. So even interrogating what this means in terms of the training that that I'm involved in providing students, how do I collaborate or resist white dominant values when they're being incredibly oppressive in multiple professional, personal circumstances, as a friend, as a community member. I think that the word that comes to mind is always, and the commitment to coming back to something even when always escapes my mind.
Yeah. Amy, did you want to go?
No, go ahead.
I guess, yeah, I was thinking kind of similar. I have a jumble of words in my notes about this I was thinking about. But I think for me, it starts with taking leadership, like particularly taking, like being led by folks of color, and really that's important to me, right? So really having, there can be this way where like I'm always striving. I have a PhD, clearly achievement oriented and those sorts of things. And so really, for me, there's this thing of wanting to make sure I'm not just trying to like check off a box or be the most woke or the most anti-racist, but really making sure that this interrogating keeps coming up, but that I'm like interrogating my intentions and my purpose. And so, and then thinking about what the ways that I enact it across all of my different identities are trying to practice either listening, educating, supporting, organizing, contributing, really trying to figure out what power do I hold in this situation in my role, and how can I use that in the service of justice? And I wouldn't say I do that well all the time, but that's my goal. And so when I reflect back on any given interaction, whether it was with a group of white folks or just any group, like how did I engage in those things, and was it in the service of justice, or was it in the service of something more nefarious, something less than justice?
What I was going to say, Tiffany, was that for me, how I address these issues varies from space to space. And over the course of my life, I have felt, even though this has always been important to me, that I have done it differently and more effectively in some places more than others. And, I'm finally at the stage in my life and my career where, the old saying is, the older you get, the braver you become. When I look back at my life, I feel like I wasn't always as brave around interrogating whiteness as I wish I would have been. But I feel more free now in a lot of different settings, even where I don't have as much power, like in my institution, where there's plenty of people that have more power than me. And there's something at a new level that I feel freed up to do that. I try to think about it in each space. Like even as a parent, I am a white parent in an interracial relationship with 2 biracial children. And, so it's always been a part of my personal life as long as I remember, but there's all the little ways. It finally occurred to me after years of eating out with my family that when my family was all together, so we have 2 Black individuals and myself, and we were always asked if we needed separate checks. Like there was no way that we could be a family, right? No one ever asked us that. And it finally occurred to me, and now it's like this ongoing joke with my family about how this happens at every single restaurant. And that's about the power of whiteness, right? That I can't be part of that family. They must be their own family. So I think it's everywhere. We just don't always free ourselves up to see it.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Casey. That was it's a powerful example to me of the ways that the power is, I don't want to say painful, but like it's isolating, right? Like that there's within that privileged space, there's this isolation that is part of why like tearing down all these oppressive structures is so important, and is in our own self-interest as well, right? To tear down those structures. I think there's, people talk about guilt a lot, but I think about how isolating and keeping us from being in our full humanity it can be, right? These structures are. And so that's part of the piece that motivates. Go ahead, Casey, you had something you were trying to say too.
Yeah, I was just thinking, like a student, I guess, like in that role, always kind of having this narrative too of trying to combat against this idea that like you have to play the game in order to have access to the game, to change the game, and balancing that and how that's inherently steeped, right, in a lot of like white supremacy essentially, and finding small ways, which I think everyone has kind of touched on, and like what ways do you have power in those spaces. And for me, a lot of times too, it's come down to the people around me as well, is like having people around me that also are working towards like liberatory practices, who are like arm in arm with me, who are willing to kind of take on that fight with me. And like having those people around me, like that has been probably the most probably the most empowering experience is having like my people to be able to do that with. And that's what I think when there are moments where I feel like maybe I don't have access to the power that of like the institution or things like that as a student, that I've felt more energized and more empowered to kind of fight against it.
Thanks for that. Oh, go ahead, Dan, sorry.
No, the spaces like last year I found I don't know, I joined the gay men's chorus last year, and that you know, on the surface felt like super comfortable at first, and then looking at the role of whiteness in a very large, very white, very cis chorus really pushed me to think about, you know, okay, how do I do this here? I don't hold a position of power in a classroom, or I'm not sort of in a university. Like, I don't call the shots, but I do call something, right? I call the capacity to engage with other chorus members.
I think, Dan, even sharing that, even this, that it brought up for me that I live in a very diverse city, and then sometimes I'll be like, oh, damn, I just self-selected the most whitest space possible. And like, just even noticing that, like, even, but then having that conversation, like, hey, how did we just curate the space? What did we just do? Who are we excluding? What are we doing? What's happening here? How do we, you know, like, and it, yeah, so even just kind of recognizing and figuring out how to address that in all of those spaces is something that's interesting. I'm going to move. Our next one was, what resources or frameworks and or people do you use to guide your anti-racism practices?
I think the framework that's been most that I've gone to most often in the last several years, that was recently revised, was the Unpacking White Dominant Cultural Beliefs and Behaviors as they manifest in systems, which helped me to articulate different values that do show up in lots of systems that I work in, and helped me to see, how do I manifest these? How do I push back against them? How do I even understand them? So that's been a framework that's been super helpful for me. Ibram Kendi's Stand from the Beginning has been a very helpful framework for thinking about how I relate to racist ideas, that even the idea of racism. And then also valuable relationships. I've been really lucky to have a pretty much daily 7 a.m. Friend consultation call while a friend is driving to the gym and I'm walking my dog. And we kind of unpack what our days are going to look like in context of white supremacy. And that's been super helpful.
Oh, go ahead.
Amy. Go ahead, Amy.
To build on Dan Kende's work, also How to Be an Anti-Racist, which is his newest book. The thing that's so powerful about what he says is, it's so often that we get caught up in the individualized focus of racism, like racism behavior. You know, someone's asking whether the current president is racist, and a politician saying, I don't know what's in his heart. You know, so Kende talks about, which I've always believed, that, you know, that's where we get locked in, and why racism may never end if that's where the focus is. So that's why it's so important to do what you're talking about, Dan, you know, doing that unpacking. Of course, White Fragility, I think, is by Robin DiAngelo, is awesome, because of her focus, especially talking about progressive people with liberal values who don't want to view ourselves as racist, sort of like how racism lives in those worlds. And then, of course, I have to sort of acknowledge the great work of Annalise Singh, the Racial Healing Handbook. There's so many more resources now, but I wanted to highlight that one as well.
I'm like, I feel like I was like so many everywhere, all over on this one, but I think where I'm finding the most grounding for myself and what's useful with my practice and my clients and how I'm kind of seeing myself in the different roles that we just named are like working through the cultural somatic lens. So Resmaa Menakem wrote the book My Grandmother's Hands, which is kind of the book version of cultural somatic work. And then also working with Tada Hizomi, who works out of Canada and is a cultural somatics practitioner person. Those folks have definitely led a lot of this work for me more recently. And the piece, especially out of Resmaa's languaging, that really resonates is the blowing trauma through each other's bodies, and that we have this history of blowing trauma through each other's bodies, and that piece, when we can take responsibility and work on unpacking the trauma that's been blown through our own bodies, as well as taking the responsibility for the trauma that comes along with the color of our skin and our other intersecting identities, we can start to really do some good healing work, and start to really change how we are somatically just changing spaces with one another. I am being in Seattle, where Robin DiAngelo is from and writes about the white liberal. That's very real here. White spaces are prominent and everywhere. And that's been a large part of my learning, just is trying to figure out, like, what does community look like, and how do you be in beloved community, and how do you create community that isn't turning into these like sounding boards where we're all just repeating each other and nobody's really pushing on each other or trying to like actually further how we're learning with one another. So yeah, face to face has been a lot of it for me too.
Oh, you can't hear me? Can you hear me now? Okay. I was just saying, I just finished How to Be Anti-Racist actually over winter break, and that's a phenomenal resource. The other thing that I've used that I really loved, it was the Me and White Supremacy Workbook by Layla Saad. And it's kind of on this premise, I think it's 28 days of like a journaling and reflective experience. And it starts with things that are pretty common, like me and white supremacy, me and white fragility, and there's reflection prompts, and then it goes into things that are a little bit more nuanced and how those are showing up in your life, and you're kind of like that phone call that you were talking about, Dan, of like, how is your day structured in a way that's either supporting or against white supremacy, right? And she has this really beautiful framework of radical truth telling with yourself, and like being a good ancestor. So her whole workbook is set up on this idea that I want to be a good ancestor to the people that come after me in this world. And part of that is doing this work within ourselves. I think that's a really phenomenal resource. If anyone's interested, I can share that.
I just want to follow up real quick to Tiffany. You sort of implied this. I think we also have to be willing to continually sit in the pain of racism that we indirectly cause and directly cause. And so, because we have to have that duality of focusing on our whiteness, maybe in white spaces, but also the other. I was just, last week, I just finished Just Mercy. And it was gut-wrenching, just so painful to read, but it was so important for me to read that. Like 13th, Ava DuVernay's documentary. We have to do that, not so that we get stuck in self-flagellation, but so that we always remember why we're doing this work. It's really not about us. And so we can't be disconnected from that. So we have to find that balance, I guess. So I just wanted to add that piece.
Yeah, I live my life in memes now, which I guess is a thing that happens. But I think there's that piece too of always remembering, like, yeah, we do need to keep moving towards that to really have, because because honestly, we can not, right? Like it's so easy. Like if we don't pursue these stories or this media, it's pretty chill to just be like, well, I guess I can just hang out in my house and not have to worry about things. And, like there's, and so, yeah, I know I've talked with some folks who are like, well, it's exhausting to always look at these things. Like, is it? Like, it seems like really, honestly, the least we can do is read the stories and do the, like, that's, so if you're, that's, I guess, the fragility piece, right? Like that, like, I feel exhausted or I can't do it. Like, it's like, we got to buck up. Like, we can't, like, there's not, because I mean, that's privilege in itself to like, oh, I was so exhausting to read about this. Like, well, I didn't live it. Like, I didn't have to live it. And so really, really acknowledging that piece, I think, is something that I always want to hold both of those, like that. It was heavy, and that's just do it. I guess that's my, so I didn't share my frameworks yet. I think one's, I think just starting, like my early ones, right, like white privilege readers and looking at Angela Davis, Women, Race, and Class was huge for me as a big learning one. White Like Me, all the Tim Wise stuff, those things were huge for me, in addition to all the ones that you all have kind of talked about. And then, but I think, for me, mentorship in, probably, the way I come across where I just said, buck up and do it, I tend to be pretty aggressive in my socialization and those sorts of things. So a thing that I've had to work on is to be softer in it sometimes, or to recognize when just blowing it up is not going to be the most effective. And so I've had a lot of really amazing mentors who have helped me to be like, yeah, that sucks, and you're going to need to figure out how to find your words through it, because you can actually influence this space in ways that someone else can't right now. And so if you can't find the words, then that's not okay. And so really recognizing that part has been helpful. And so that's where I think the folks that I've been able to check in with have been like, yeah, no, good job, you went off, great, everybody felt bad, nothing changed. So for me, figuring out how to help try to move a process forward instead, while not doing the like, well, then I'm going to get the power and then I'll work on it. Finding that balance has been a big piece for me, that I don't do some name dropping, like Clady Davis III and Arpana Inman have helped me a lot in that process. So folks who deserve like extra bonuses in their life, and yeah, for those things. I forgot I'm the facilitator. I got all into that. Okay, our next question is, how have you fallen short in your efforts to combat white supremacy, and what have you learned from those experiences?
I think one way of falling short has been in recognizing at times when I've been racially microaggressive or macroaggressive, and as my form of apology, trying to solve all racism in an explanation, like going into a very intellectualized space that takes way too much personal responsibility for doing away with white supremacy as a whole system, which in a way I feel is rooted in colorblindness, in that it suggests that like, this is so not real that I can actually do that, I can get rid, which is so not true. When actually what needs to happen is I'm sorry. That's one way when I need to check my whiteness, if I notice that happening.
Tiffany, I'm like, ooh, I don't know if it's the Reno or the punk or what, but man, yeah. I've had some people tell me to chill out. So, I think in some ways that's felt like ways that I've fallen short. And I also hold a both and on that, because it's often white people who are telling me that I'm falling short in those moments. So I'm always a little fascinated to be like, am I falling short or am I making you uncomfortable? And it's probably both, because I can take it down a notch. And, but every time I think about this question, that what goes through my head is like, I'm always falling short. because I still have white supremacy in me. I still am a I'm a therapist, so I'm still working in a field where white thinking rules. Even if I'm working through a different lens and I'm trying to do things differently, I'm still doing things within a system and under a license and all of these things that hold me in certain boxes. And I'm still teaching in universities, and I'm doing these things, so I'm like all the time. And also in all of these places, I'm also doing what I do really well, which is disrupt and discuss. So I hold a both and of like, I've been on this constant learning curve and I'm still failing every day.
I feel that way about my teaching. I teach multicultural counseling, and don't get me wrong, I can't think of anyone else in my department that would even want to teach it, or could, I think, handle the nuances of it in some ways because they're not versed in the field. But to your point, Shannon, I think I don't disrupt in the classroom. I don't kind of shake it up. I don't I'm just now talking about how do I decolonize my multicultural class. Whereas I used to think of that as only occurring in non-multicultural classes. I have to decolonize those other classes, but not that one. And so I'm thinking about that now and thinking about what that means, how I structure learning, all those kinds of things. And it's kind of like, like, what does that mean? And I feel most strongly about that because I feel like that's one of the most important spaces where it's important that I get it right, even though I'm always sort of struggling to get it right, because it can have such an impact on so many people who can then go out and impact other people. So that's the area I feel that I struggle the most, and I'm constantly trying to figure out how to do it better.
That learning curve is still really I feel that too. Like it's a constant learning curve, and I think I've failed on almost like two spectrums of it, where like in one space of feeling like I needed to stand up and say something and maybe didn't in that moment, and like failing in inaction and what I learned from that, and then also on the other end where like people that I really love that are people of color have confided in me that maybe they were microaggressed or something had happened or someone in a position of power was abusing it, and I felt so quick move to action, like, well, we should do this and da-da-da, and just so quickly going into action without kind of sitting in that space with them of like, okay, no, I need to just listen right now. This is not about me moving to action. Kind of to your point, Jan, of like, I'm not going to solve this problem right away. So I feel like I have examples in my life of both and of those things, of that duality again, of like learning from inaction and also learning from being moved too quickly to action.
Yeah, that I resonate so much with that, Casey. And then I had a different answer in my notes on this, but I think the place where I feel like I failed the most, like what was our actual thing, the combating efforts to combat white supremacy, is with my blood, with family. I have never successfully had those conversations. I've tried, and I've been so good at helping to coach others into having those conversations with their families and to do all of that, and just nope, it never, maybe with one uncle. I think I've got one uncle, a niece, a nephew, and a cousin that I've been able to have those conversations with. But so that for me is the hardest one, is like how to continue having those when it's in your circle. Because I think most folks know, but yeah, my family are pretty straight up, just like proud white supremacists. And so that piece of like how to bridge that has always been a place where I struggle. Yeah.
I'm going to jump in really quickly because there's somebody in the Q&A that asked a question that is like, I think it's a little out of context. And I'm curious if they could give a little more information because I think it's a good question.
Mm.
There are, for instance, Black YouTubers I've seen who would take you to task on the issue of white supremacy. How would you respond?
Mm.
I'm not sure what exactly they mean, take us to task. And then I'm like, take us to task. So I don't know if anybody else has thoughts on that.
So I think thanks for clarifying with our asking someone to expand on their question. And then I do realize now it's about 3:45. We do have the rest of our questions here, but it seems like it might be a good time to shift over into the Q&A for Annalise to come back on. Does that make sense? Cool. Awesome.
Yeah, thank you all. You know, I've really enjoyed the discussion, and thanks, Shannon, for finding David's question on the Q&A. And David, if you want to, in the chat box, like, tell us a little more about what your question is. I'm sure folks would be happy to answer it. I mean, I think one of the questions that came in on the Q&A is, how do you balance interrogating your whiteness, which has a negative connotation, with the guilt that you mentioned that we shouldn't feel? And I think that came up early in the webinar. You all were talking about that. So any thoughts on that?
One of previous conversations that we've had when guilt came up was this idea that that also shouldn't be something that stops you. Like, you can feel guilt about it and still act, and still kind of like act on it, interrogate your whiteness, and work through that at the same time. Like, they don't necessarily need to be really exclusive of one another. That was one thing that kind of came up for me.
Awesome. Thank you, Casey.
I also think that recognizing that acting from guilt can have a negative impact. So it really is about being mindful of what I'm feeling, slowing down, and not always acting from that feeling space, not judging it for anything, and not letting it call the shots, and sort of understanding where it fits. I mean, I think that it speaks to kind of thinking about what is like the racialized component of emotion for a lot of white people, and how does that fit? How does it fit? And again, like, having a framework like, you know, like white fragility can be really helpful, I think, in that way.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's hard for things like guilt and shame and shoulds to be liberatory. So I think we have to find a way to not be held down by them, and to find a way to exist with those feelings as part of our experience, but move past them or move through them somehow. Because I don't know that they're ever can or need to go away, because they're reminders. They're momentary reminders. It's just that when they last longer than their value of waking us up, that's when they're harmful.
And I think one thing that's been helpful is, like, to have it, just because I'm having those feelings doesn't mean I need to make the process about those feelings, right? So that to work through my feelings on my own or with my other white buddies, and to kind of have a place where I'm working through that, while also following leadership, doing what's asked of me, contributing to anti-racist struggles. Like, they can exist together, and my job is to not make the space about me or needing to take care of my feelings in that space.
Thank you all. And I know, just as a reminder for attendees, you can chat with folks through the chat box function, but you can also hit the Q&A tab and write your question. And panelists, feel free to answer those questions directly as we're moving through this live Q&A, because we've got about 10 minutes. And so, you know, this is a panel with it's weird to say wealth of knowledge and expertise talking about white supremacy and white allyship, but I think y'all know what I mean. People who are trying to live through these practices. I know that this group kind of received some suggestions via Twitter, so I do want to ask you some of those questions that came in related to students. Like, what are Elisa Burney asked, like, what are some specific strategies for graduate students who are working on challenging white supremacy, but are also working within power hierarchies, right? So what are some suggestions you have there?
I can start, unless Amy, one thing that I always want to start when I'm thinking about being a student or with students is that there's so much power that you actually do have access to. And so so really spending time doing a power analysis, seeing who holds power in these situations, and then using that in the service of what you need to do. So it's not, maybe it's not your voice, but maybe there's a student group, maybe there's a conversation you can have with the dean, maybe there's a conversation you can have with the president. There's a lot of power, and folks will try to make it seem like you do not have power, but that's not always true. And there's a lot of things, there is a lot of power within that role of student, that can be accessed. So I guess, yeah, it's paying attention to power and then figuring out how to use it.
And find your allies, find other students, maybe even junior faculty, other people who feel disenfranchised by the system, and find people outside of your program to link with, to give you not only perspective and strength, but to come up with strategies. This is not something you need to do on your own, because students, especially Tiffany, students together have a lot of power with their faculty. If students join together, believe me, that's something that faculty are very cognizant of and aware of, and responsive to, not always in the best of ways, but they do respond.
Yeah, thanks for that, Amy. I think, one of the things that's so important, such an important thread in the 12 months of building a counseling psychology of liberation, is we're really trying to build towards that counseling psychology of the future, and we're living that now, right? So, university is built for mostly white, cisgender, straight dudely folks, right? And so I think within those power hierarchies, none of us who even may fit those descriptions really fits. And so I love what you all are saying, is that, this is the takeover. This is why we're here. And, I think that town halls, I have an associate dean position, and I love when a student comes and says, hey, we need to talk more about whiteness. I'm like, yay. That allows me to start an exploring white privilege group, which we have in my college, that they've been kicking for the last 3 years. So I love what you all are saying about almost like reclaiming power and wielding power in different ways. And I do think, I ran a couple of polls while you all were sharing, and one of them was how many people had received kind of, just information about white privilege in counseling psych courses, and 90% said yes. So that's great. But when I asked about interrupting racism as a white ally, it got interesting. Like 20% of folks felt like their growing edge was doing this at home. 40% said their growing edge was doing it in workspaces. And 60% said it felt like more of a growing edge in community. So I was wondering if you all could comment on that. It seems like community is really the leading growing edge of what do you do when you witness racism, and how do you interrupt it?
I can try to do this briefly. There's so many different elements of how this can happen in community. If you're walking down the street versus if your friend makes a comment versus if you're, sitting in a group of practitioners, right? So I have kind of talked with folks a lot about how do you do this when, in all of these places which require a stepping out of a comfort zone and into a discomfort zone. And one of the ways that my community of folks here have been practicing is we all name a place where we know we don't do well stepping into a discomfort zone. So one particular person knows that they do not like to do cop watching. They will drive past if they see a cop stopping somebody, because it's their discomfort zone. And so we'll buddy up and go and cop watch together. And so that somebody is there to help soothe the nervous system of the other person, or if somebody tends to freeze when there's a conflict that's arising, kind of helping to step into that zone with them. So we've been doing a buddy system around it, and that's been actually really fun and a way of building community while also holding accountability with one another. that spreads across.
Cool. Thank you, Shannon. Anyone else?
I think one of the reasons why maybe that number is high is because our early training didn't really, up till now, encourage us to be members of our community. You know what I mean? In many respects. So we were part of our therapist community, our university community, and didn't really say the core of our work should be in the community. And I think so many of us were trained that way that many of us aren't in those spaces. Some of us, like you, Annalise, and many others are, but many people aren't. And so I have to believe that that's part of it, our training.
I was thinking similarly that I'm wondering if a large reason that community was the highest percentage was because I feel like it often is the hardest to make time for many people in that similar way. And I think the reality is like it has to be a priority, right? Like we have to create the time for it. And as a student, like I think about that too. And like I'm totally guilty of that, of not always putting that as a priority because it feels like there's so many things around you that are happening that need immediate attention. But I think it's making community, like you said, Amy, a priority.
Mm-hmm. As you were talking about that, it also made me think about and Amy, like the way that we're trained, and there's this isolating process of higher ed at becoming a therapist, becoming a psychologist. And then there's also that piece of multiple relationships, right? That's a piece that sometimes comes up. I work with a lot of folks who are activists in my private practice, and then that they're going to see me out at the protest. They're going to see me if we're going to an anti-racist meeting, we might be there. And so then there's not a lot of guidance in the ACA code and the APA code about how one negotiates those boundaries or what that means when you're part of an activist community. And so then I think that it kind of pushes towards this isolation. And I think that's a part of an important liberatory movement of our field is, I think that Suzette Spate did a great talk at Teachers College one year about the being real and boundaries. What does it mean to have boundaries around realness and being really in your community? And I think that's that's a piece that we can continue to work for in our field.
That is awesome. Go
Going
ahead.
back to something that Amy said about really being grounded in community. I think that there's no way that this isn't personal. And so if it is a professional job that we're doing surrounding it is important that we're doing this in our workspaces, but there's also frankly some protection in that this is consistent with a lot of at least stated values, even though if they're not lived values, at least they're stated values of a lot of counseling psych programs. And there may be more risk in community when we don't know how people who we care for are going to actually respond. And that's why I think engaging with our friends and, for our white friends in outside of our professional lives and having this in a heart space in all those ways is a very important grounding tool to doing the work in our professional lives.
And we are closing in on the last minute and a half of the webinar, which is hard to believe. And so I wanted to just kind of see if each of you could share kind of some final thoughts as we wrap up. Probably have about 10 seconds each. So I apologize for the short time, but would love to kind of hear your final thoughts.
Can I say just that one quote that we used as we were preparing was Adrienne Marie Brown's, "If the goal was to increase love rather than winning or dominating a constant opponent, I think we could actually imagine liberation from constant oppression." And that came up for me with Dan. I think that's what I hope I'm working towards.
Awesome. Thank you.
I think to follow up on Shannon's grounding at the very beginning, we all need to lead with our heart and with all of us for this to work, for this to happen.
Yeah, and connect, find allies in it, find other white folks that you can also talk about your whiteness with, connect. I think that's at the heart of this, is building connection.
Don't be afraid to do it differently.
I'm also going to say be with love.
Anything else before we end? Well, yeah, I cannot thank you enough. I mean, I think that the best thing about these webinars is they are recorded, and you will be able to find them on the homepage of the Division of Counseling Psychology. And I welcome you to be in touch with our panelists today. You can email us individually, search us online, and we're happy to continue to dialogue with you. We realize there are a few questions we didn't get to, so I hope that you reach out to folks. I do want to give a little plug for our next webinar, which is on January 30th, next week at 9 a.m. Pacific, 12 p.m. Eastern. It's about building a trans and non-binary pipeline into counseling psychology, creating equitable and just environments from admissions to orientation and more. Again, the 12 months of building a counseling psych of liberation are really just that, trying to imagine this world that, you know, we should be living in right now, but it's the same thing our freedom fighting ancestors did, so we could even have these conversations. So it really does mean something. So many thanks to our panelists and many thanks to our attendees. I hope you continue these conversations. And you know, I've got to give a plug for our Counseling Psych Conference in New Orleans, April 2nd through the 5th. So we hope you can join us in New Orleans, where we definitely have some issues around white supremacy and liberation to talk about. Have a great evening, and we will talk to you soon. Goodbye.